Do you remember, some of you who are old enough, do you remember Paul Harvey and his noon radio show, The Rest of the Story? Do you remember that? Some of you do. I see some nods. Let me tell you one of his stories briefly. The year is 1820. Phineas is 10 years old. When he was born in Bethel, Connecticut in 1810, his grandfather deeded him a parcel of land, a sizable portion of Connecticut known as Ivy Island. The growing boy was constantly reminded of his property. Phineas was different from his playmates. While they dreamed of dragons and knights, his fantasies were of Ivy Island. Someday he would be lord of his own territory. He'd build a house, start a farm, raise cattle, rule his domain. When you own an island, you feel important. And when you own an island, you want to see it. So he pleaded with his father to take him to the island. And finally, in the summer of 1820, when he was 10 years old, his father agreed. Early that morning, Phineas, his father, and a hired hand climbed into the buggy and began the long-anticipated journey. Finally, Phineas could see his land. He could scarcely sit still. Are we there yet? Can we see it from here? And his father would encourage him to be patient. Finally, his dad pointed north beyond a meadow to a row of tall trees stretching into the sky. There, he said, there is Ivy Island. Phineas was overcome. He jumped from the wagon and dashed through the meadow, leaving his father far behind. He raced to the row of trees into an opening from which Ivy Island was visible. But when he saw the land, his heart sunk. Ivy Island was 5 acres of snake-infested marshland. His grandfather had called it the most valuable land in Connecticut, but it was a worthless piece of barren land. His father had told him it was a generous gift. It wasn't. It was a joke, a cruel joke. As stunned Phineas stared, the father and the hired hand roared with laughter. Phineas was not the fortunate beneficiary of the family. He was the laughingstock of the family. Grandfather Taylor had played a joke on his heir. Phineas didn't laugh, nor did he forget. The disappointment shaped his life. He, the deceived one, made a lifestyle out of deception. The little boy fooled, made a career out of fooling people. The rest of the story, you don't know him as Phineas. You know him as Phineas Taylor Barnum. P.T. Barnum, an American showman, scam artist, and entertainer, remembered for promoting celebrated hoaxes and for founding the circus that became the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, the Barnum and Bailey Circus. The carnival show, you know, with all the sideshows, purpose, part you with your money, trickery, fakes, fortune tellers, supposed magic shows, attractions that never live up to their billing, a life deceiving and disappointing people. We know him as the one who coined the phrase, "There's a sucker born every minute." That was his words. And he spent his life proving it. Now, friends, that's the theme of our story and our encounter for this morning. A story of broken promises, unmet expectations, dashed hopes. A story of disappointment, letdown, broken hearts. It's no fun being let down, is it? It's no fun being disappointed. It's no fun having your dreams and hopes dashed. It's no fun thinking that you're being taken to the promised land only to find yourself in a swamp. It's no fun when others don't come through for you the way you'd expected. When people let you down, and especially when you think it's God that's let you down. The world is full of P.T. Barnums. Well, it's Easter Sunday afternoon. The first Easter, Jesus is out for a walk, an 11-kilometer walk from Jerusalem to the little village of Emmaus, just northwest of the city. It would be like walking from here to Oakwood, just over 11 kilometers. By this time, everybody in the whole area knew of the events of the last 12 hours. Jesus' capture and trial and death and the strange disappearance of his body. In our story, we're told that Jesus catches up to and falls in step with Cleopas and one who was unnamed. Some think it was his wife. Others speculate it was a friend or acquaintance. Some think it was Cleopas' son, Simon. But two Jesus' followers. That's all the Bible indicates. Verse 14 says they were talking as they walked. Now you understand, this is not a pleasant walk. The world had tumbled in on them. If you could have seen them, feet shuffling, head down, shoulders drooped, faces dark and brooding, the look stamped on them of despair. And you can imagine their conversation. Why did the people turn against him? He walked into this trap knowing what was coming. We don't understand. He could have come down from the cross. Why didn't he? Why did he just let Pilate crush him and push him around? He was supposed to deliver us from these Romans and their evil oppression. He was going to be our leader, our king. Senseless. To what end? No deliverance. No more forgiveness. No more healing. No more goodness. All hope perished. What do we do now? Here's the first thing you need to know, friends, about disappointment. It's usually caused by unmet expectations. Verse 21 in the Bible story says, but they had hoped that Jesus was the one. Failed expectation lies at the heart of every disappointment. We expect something and get something else. We expect beef for dinner and get chicken or broccoli. We thought we would get a refund from our tax return and we end up owing money. The weather report promised sunshine for the weekend of the outdoor wedding, but we get rain. Disappointments like these are so common, you would think we'd be used to them. But things are different with God. You see, we expect better treatment from Him. We know other people let us down, even though knowing this doesn't lessen our disappointment when they do. But God's not like that. God doesn't lie. God's reliable. Cleopas and his companion and the rest of Jesus' followers really had hoped that Jesus would be their Redeemer and Savior, the one to rescue their nation and restore it to its former glory. Kick those blankety-blankety Romans out. Peter, or Pilate and Herod out, Jesus in. But Jesus is dead, and Pilate and Herod are still in. Unfulfilled expectations. God didn't do what they wanted and expected Him to do. Ever happened to you? You pray for healing and your loved one dies. The job that seems so perfect for you goes to someone else. The situation you prayed God would intervene blows up in your face, etc., etc., etc. God is this all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, sovereign being, and we know how He should act and how things should be. Jesus is the Messiah. He won't sleep in my storm. He won't stand idly by while terrorists bomb buildings and kill innocent children. He'll certainly intervene and deliver me from my crises and pain. Jesus won't die. When the chief priests and rulers hand Him over to be crucified, He'll resist and overpower them. He'll do what He's supposed to do. And then when God doesn't adjust His agenda to meet our expectations, we're disappointed and hurt and angry and confused. The problem is that we think that our mind and God's mind are the same. We know what we want, and we put that on God. We let our desires govern our expectations. It's not that we don't believe God can't. It's not God's inability that causes us deep disappointment. We know what God can do. What bothers us is the fact that God hasn't done what we believed in our hearts He should and could have done. We misread God's purposes. We forget what Isaiah of old said. Do you remember he quotes God as saying to us in Isaiah 55, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." God doesn't do what we think He should. Disappointment. Then suddenly, without Cleopas and his companion really being aware of it, a stranger is walking with them. He comes up behind them and intrudes into their conversations. "What's troubling you, boys?" he says. And they're thinking, "Man, did you just drop out of outer space? Duh. You're probably the only person in this whole city who doesn't know what's going on." What they actually said was, "Are you just a visitor here and don't know the things that have happened in the last 3 days?" He said, "What things?" Cleopas shakes his head bitterly and recounts tersely the things that had happened to Jesus, and finished by saying rather harshly, "We had hoped He was the one to redeem Israel." Here's the second thing you need to know about disappointment. It can cloud your vision, mess up your perspective. Clouds your vision, messes up your perspective. You see, they're talking about Jesus, but where's Jesus? He's right beside them, and they don't even recognize him. You see, folks, disappointment can do that to you. Blind us to the presence of God. Make us feel like God has forgotten us or forsaken us when he really hasn't. When we're disappointed, our focus turns inward. We get all wrapped up in our pain and anger and hurt, and we don't even see or feel God. This Jesus had said to them many times in the last 3 years. I'll never leave you nor forsake you. Nothing can separate you from God's love. No trouble, no hardship, no disappointment. Lo, I am with you always. But deep disappointment clouds our vision. You see, if God was here, if God cared, he'd do something about this situation. He wouldn't have let this happen. The third thing you need to know about disappointment is that it can harden your heart. We get cynical. We get calloused. And then when good news does come, we don't accept it and we can't think straight. And we see everything through these negative eyes. If you notice in verses 22 to 24, they explain to this man, who they didn't recognize as Jesus, everything that had happened. They admit that some women had gone to the tomb and found it empty, no body. And that angels had appeared and said he was alive. And some of their friends went and found the same thing, just as the women said. But in their disappointment, they refused to accept it. They weren't about to believe them. In fact, they saw it as bad news. As if it's not bad enough that Jesus was killed, now some grave robbers have taken the body and duped some of our friends. Jesus even said to them, how foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the Scriptures said. They're thinking, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on you. Cleopas and his friends were simply doing what we all do when we've been hurt. We put our hearts in a shell. We refuse to be hurt again. We refuse to take another risk, and we close ourselves off, and we get hard and calloused and cynical. Been hurt in love? I'll never allow myself to trust another man or another woman. I'll never allow myself to fall in love again. Had a promise violated? I'll never trust anybody else again. Had your heart broken? I'll never let myself get close to anyone else again. I'll never again be vulnerable to anyone. We do like P.T. Barnum. Settle the score by blaming the world and hardening our hearts. You know, there's a fine line between disappointment and anger, between hurt and hate, between bitterness and blame. We all face disappointment, hurt, and bitter experiences, but when we cross the line into anger, hate, or blame, our hearts get hardened. Well, that's the ugly part of the story. But praise be to Jesus, that's not how the story ends. Let's look at how Jesus quickly dealt with their disappointment. From disappointment to resurrected presence.